Welcome back. In this session, we will do some refactorization of some SQL query. As you can see, the URL here is quite tedious to write, if you had to do it by hand. And also, it's not an easy one to remember. So you don't want your developer to be writing this every time they want to query the files. Also, the URL may have to be changed every time we move from one end to the other. For example, if you have separate storage accounts for dev, test, and prod environments, you will have to make the changes to all your queries whenever you want to use them in a new environment, which is not ideal. That's where external data sources come into play. They help us hide that URL and give it a meaningful name. External data sources, or Synapse objects that you can create in Synapse, pointing to your external data source such as your data lake storage Gen 2 in this case, or even two data sources outside of Azure such as Oracle, Teradata, etc. Once you create an external data source, you can use them as an option in the open row set function. Let's create a data source pointing to this storage account, and I'll show you how to use that within the select statement as well. We can use the command create external data source followed by the name of the data source to create the data source. I'm going to use the container name as the data source name because we are going to create the data source on the container within our storage account. So let me copy this. Instead of the hyphens in the name here, I'm going to use underscores because hyphens are not allowed on the name here. And then the other options you need with the with clause, you can provide a few options. The one we're interested in here is the location. So we want to give the location to our data source to be pointing to. As we said, we are going to point up to the container. So I'm going to leave the raw folder out, but I'm going to just use up to the container level. So that is the location. You can provide other options, as I said, to the data source. One important one is credential. In this case, we already have access to our storage account and the container in it. But if you have an external storage account which you don't have access to, then you can use the credential to provide access. So you can use something like a SAS key and create a credential on top of that and then use that credential to create the data source. So now the data source will have access. We're going to talk about that later in the course. But I just thought I'll mention it here. So now that we've got the SQL queries to create the data source, let's execute that. So we should have the data source in our database now. So one thing to remember is you can only create external data sources or any objects yourself on the databases you create, so you can't create it on a master database. So as we said before, we are going to use NYC Taxi Discovery as the database for all our like here. So I've created the external data source in that database as well. So let's navigate to the Data tab and look at that database, which is the NYC Taxi Discovery. If you're not seeing the database here, go to SQL Databases and then click Refresh because it only shows up once you refreshed it. But my database is here and let me expand that. And within the external resources, I should see the external data source. And as you can see, we got the NYC Taxi data as the external data source. So now let's change our SQL queries to select data from our file. But this time we are going to use the external data source. So as we said, we don't want to have this ugly URL here, so I'm going to just remove the URL and we got the folder / file name which is raw/taxes on .csv. But we also need to provide the external data source here. In order to do that, you use the data source option. So this data underscore source and then you provide the name of the data source. So we call that one NYC Taxi data. So let me copy and paste that and then I need a comma as well here and let's execute that select statement and it should run as it did before because our data source is now pointing at the URL and it's a nicer looking select statement. It doesn't have these URLs or anything messy. If you have a developer in the team, you only have to tell them to actually use the data source NYC Taxi data and you will see all your files under the raw folder. This is one approach to designing your data sources, which in this case we have pointed our data source to the project container. So that means using that data source, you can access all the data that belongs to our project, but in some cases or in some projects that I've seen, we tend to create multiple data sources, one pointing to the raw folder within that. So if is the data ingested, which is in it in its raw form, and then you may have under the data source which points to say, for example, the processed folder which has got all the processed data, all the aggregated data. So in order to do that, it's quite simple. All you have to do is you create another external data source, or you wouldn't have this in the first place, but you will have a new one and you can call this whatever you like. I've seen people using bronze, silver, and gold. So bronze is raw data. Silver is slightly processed. Actually, you've got cleansing and things like that done. And the gold is your gold data, which has got business, meaning it's highly aggregated. So you could just simply call this one nice bronze, for example. But we won't do that. We're going to just take the same name with an underscore, and we're going to go up to the raw folder within this container. So when you create this data source, that will directly put you on the raw folder, so you don't have to specify the raw folder when you select the data. So in order to access data from this data source, you would specify that data source which is pointing up to raw, and then you just have to specify taxes on that. CSV. So if I just run this one, it would be the same result as the other one. All it's doing is actually the data source is putting you up to the folder, and then you're looking at the file within the raw folder. This is another approach. As I said, actually, the people who are doing the analysis of the ingested data will normally be told to use this data source. And then if you have another group of people who are just doing analysis, they'll be reporting. They would be told actually, okay, use the gold data source, which might be called NYC taxi data _ gold or processed or something similar. So I just thought I'll tell you both approaches here. They could go either way in this project, but let's say actually we are going to go down this route, which is to have the separate data sources for separate folders. So let's now drop the other data source that we don't need. To drop the data source, all you do is actually drop, and then it is drop external data source, and then whatever the data source you want to drop, and then you can just run the command and that's dropped. And if I come here and refreshed, I should see the new one rather than the old one, because we dropped the old one. One thing this user interface doesn't tell you is which storage account or the container and folder this data source is pointing it. It's okay in this case because we've just created the data source. We know that it's exactly pointing it and we created it ourselves. But when you're working in a project with multiple people, it's not always easy to find out which storage account this data source is finding it. You can get that information by running the select statement here. So as you can see here, we've got the name of the data source that we created and the location is here. It goes up to raw because in projects which are bigger, you may have tens of data sources still at that. So it's important to know how to find out that it's pointing it so that you're carrying the right data. So that's everything I wanted to talk it through in this lesson. And as I said, we will be revisiting external data sources again when we come to access the storage account, which is not already linked to our workspace. That's the end of this lesson, and I'll see you in the next.